Así que primero le pediría a Sean que nos hiciera sus comentarios, luego vamos a seguir en el orden que mencioné, para luego abrir a comentarios y preguntas del público.
Están de acuerdo con hablar en inglés porque falta tiempo, creo que puedo hacerlo más rápido y más claro. I'll make 3 points. The question of promoting tolerance and inclusion. Is it on? Can you hear me? Hear me okay? No. Okay, there we go. 3 points. The question of promoting tolerance and inclusion is an issue for every country, and I'll start with a parenthesis. We call this building shared societies, and we're talking about social inclusion and social cohesion, which we think work better than the term integration. People have told us we don't want to be integrated, or they say we are integrated. What do you want? We're third generation in this country, and we don't need to be integrated. So we found that inclusion, cohesion, or what we call shared societies or building shared societies. This is an issue for every country. That's point number 1. Point number 2, leadership is necessary. And point number 3, we have to provide leaders with the arguments so that they can believe, say, and commit to building shared societies. On the issue of this being true, this being an issue in every country, 90% of the world's nations have at least a 10% minority. Minorities are usually excluded, discriminated against, or at least perceive that they are marginalized, excluded, discriminated against. Until recently, there were some countries in the world that were homogenous, South Korea, Japan, Iceland, but even there, immigration now is making this a challenge for leaders and governments and citizenry everywhere. The issue is present everywhere in movies that we watch, in articles that we read. We looked at the last 10 days of the International Herald Tribune, and there are 15 or 20 articles related to the question of inclusion and segments of society feeling excluded. So every day, 1 or 2 articles in the Herald Tribune. Leadership is needed. There are, I'll talk a little bit later about some of the specific policy areas and action areas that are important in terms of legal frameworks, in terms of building a physical environment that is conducive to shared societies, taking care of economic disadvantages. But a big part of this is leadership. We've talked with our leaders, members of the Club of Madrid, and with other current leaders, and there are many instances where leadership on the issue makes a difference. One example, President Chissano of Mozambique was cited by other fellow former presidents as having made a big difference towards the end of the civil war in Mozambique when he started changing the language. People referred to Renamo as bandits. When he started calling them our brethren in the wilderness, then when the war came, when the war ended, he could make the argument that Renamo, despite having been defeated, despite a citizenry that said, we've won, President Chissano, you're our father, we only need you and your party, he was able to make the case that, in fact, to build a peaceful shared society, the defeated minority needed to be brought into society, into politics, into government. There are cases around the world where leadership can make a difference. If President Hu of China traveled out to Western China and said, the Uyghurs are an important, rich, valuable part of our society, it would do an immense difference in terms of calming tensions. 5 more people died in the last 24 hours in that region. We are working on something we're calling the Shared Societies Project, supported by people who've been working for years on the issue of integration, diversity, building tolerance, understanding, and they found that at a people-to-people level it works. They did a lot of work in Israel and with Arab Israelis. And people, for the most part, want peace. They want to get to know their neighbor. But often the leaders aren't stepping up. The leaders aren't providing an environment and encouraging people and discouraging discrimination and intolerance. But why aren't leaders stepping up? Well, it's politically risky. If the big guy says, I voted for you and now you're doing something for the little guy and I'm not sure I like that, I might not vote for you next time, it's a political risk. So what we found is that we have to be able to provide the arguments. There are moral arguments, there are social arguments, there are political arguments, human rights arguments. Those are all valuable and they're valid. But it may not be enough, because the majority is safe. The majority isn't suffering from human rights abuses. They aren't suffering socially. But there are other indicators about the costs of exclusion and the benefits of inclusion that leaders, I think, can begin to use in order to convince the safe, secure majority that work needs to be done to ensure that everyone is included, that everyone feels safe and at home, because that will have positive repercussions for the society at large. Let me give you some examples. On peace and security issues, studies have shown that the average increase in military spending over the average course of a civil war, 5% increase on average over a 7 or 8 year period for civil war, results in a 2% permanent decrease in GDP in a country. That's a strong argument for a leader to understand and to use. Looking at the foreign policies index of failed states, one of the indicators is group grievance. That's a good substitute for social inclusion or for social exclusion. The countries with the 7 worst indices of group grievances are in the top 14 or in the bottom 14 of failed states in the world. There's a strong correlation between people feeling excluded and a country being or in danger of being a failed state. Some economic numbers quickly. Studies in the Middle East, in Israel, have shown that the failure to fully include the Arab-Israeli population in society, in economic life, particularly in innovation, in the innovative industry of technology in Israel, has probably resulted in a loss of up to $20 billion per year. Closer to this hemisphere, studies have shown that, have suggested that the failure to fully include minorities and women in Canada, and Canada is one of the countries that has best promoted a multicultural, tolerant, diverse, and shared society, but the failure to fully include minorities and women in all spheres of economic and social life possibly has cost $174 billion. Research by World Bank economists using indicators to indicate social inclusion or exclusion. They looked at social trust and they looked at levels of crime, have suggested that over a 10-year period during which they studied the majority of the world's nations, the nations in the top quintile of social inclusion index have an average of 1.7% higher GDP than those in the bottom quintile, and over a 10-year period that's 18.6% difference in GDP. There isn't one agreed upon number, and we're going to work with, the Club of Madrid is going to work with economists to try to come up with a number, because if we can come up with one number, it will be easier to provide that to political leaders and easier for them to use when they're talking with constituents. But there is agreement that there are real costs, real economic costs to exclusion, and there are real economic benefits to inclusion, and there's some strong research and arguments and figures.